and welcome you. Today's day 4,416 that Boswell Book Company has been in business. And here tonight in conversation, of course, with Doug Gordon, who is host and producer of WPR's Beta and one of my favorite Canadians. While I'm speaking to WPR, I also should say big thanks to WPR for co-sponsoring this evening's event. If you're here in Milwaukee, you can find them on your dial, of course, at 90.7 FM. And if you're out there in internet land, you can Google them and find them there too. All of us, we're just pleased as bunch to welcome Jonathan Ames virtually here to Milwaukee. He's the author, of course, of novels like You Were Never Really Here, Wake Up, Sir, and I Love You More Than You Know. There's an exclamation point at the end of that one. Several other novels. He's, of course, the creator of television like Blunt Talk and Bored to Death. He's also a former amateur boxer and man about town. And he's here with his latest. It's a wonderfully classic, offbeat, super LA noir called A Man Named Doll. For me, I think in a wonderful way, this book harkens back to the classics of American noir, but at the same time, it's totally fresh. I read this book, and not only did I get a great road trip throughout Los Angeles, but it really reminded me of kind of why I fell in love with those classic detective novels in the first place. So without further ado, let me turn it over to Doug. Jonathan, welcome.
Thank you very much, Chris. Thank you for that wonderful introduction. It's such a pleasure to be able to talk to Jonathan Ames and to be part of this virtual Boswell Thrill Walkie event. And as Chris mentioned, among the many books that Jonathan has written, one of his novels is called Wake Up, Sir. I just wanted a chance to say it like Chris said it. But his latest novel, as Chris mentioned, is A Man Named Doll, and it's as Chris said, it's kind of pays homage to film noir and to noir novels, but at the same time, Jonathan puts his own unique spin on it. Jonathan, it's so great to have you here. Can you give us a brief synopsis of A Man Named Doll without revealing any spoilers?
Yes, well, it's a private detective novel written in the first person by a man named Doll. His birth name is Happy. His parents didn't think it was going to be a bad joke, but so he tends to often call himself Hank Doll, but his real name is Happy Doll. And he's not doing too well as a private detective these days, so he works nights as security to bring in extra money. And he often, in the past, he worked with a gerontologist because a lot of senior citizens are the victims of scams. So he kind of had a corner on the senior citizen trade, but then the gerontologist got premature dementia, and unfortunately that dried up. So when we meet him, he's kind of down and out, and then a friend of his, which I'll read the opening shortly, comes to him in some desperate trouble. And Happy goes on an adventure, ultimately trying to help his friend, and all sorts of gruesome things happen to Happy. I hope that sums things up. And it's the first of a series. If you have the finished book, the first chapter of the next book is at the end of this book. So I intend this to continue, and to continue with this character, kind of like Raymond Chandler with Philip Marlowe, or Ross MacDonald with Lou Archer, and authors like that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, now would be the perfect time to have you read an excerpt, Jonathan.
All right, and I want to apologize to the audience. I did briefly, I can't look at the chat without blocking everything, but I saw that my mom is out there, which is so sweet of her. And I apologize for a somewhat dreary background, but I think a fire extinguisher is good for a noir novel, sense of urgency and danger. I'm in a hotel room visiting family in Florida, and I do have a large alligator just to make things a little more amusing in the background. Anyway, all right. So I'm just going to read the first 2 pages of A Man Named Doll. I have to put on my cheaters for that. And here we go. This is, and the book is dedicated to Ray Pitt. All right. 1. Shelton had always been a hard man to kill, but this time he looked nervous. He came to my shabby little office on a Tuesday in early March 2019. It had been a few weeks since I'd seen him last, and he didn't look good. But that wasn't unusual. He never looked good. He was covered in liver spots like a paisley tie and was built like a bowling pin, round in the middle and meager up top. His head was small. He was in the customer's chair and I was behind my desk. He was 73, bald and short and getting shorter all the time. I was 50, Irish and nuts and getting nuttier all the time. Outside there was a downpour. LA was crying and had been for weeks. The window behind my desk was being pelted. The noise was like a symphony gone mad. It was rainy season, an old-fashioned one, an anomaly. Hadn't rained this long in years, and LA had turned Irish green. The brown scorched hills were soft with new grass like chest hair on a burn victim. You could almost think that everything was going to be all right with the world. Almost. I'm in a bad way, Hank, Shelton said. That's why I came to see you in person, even in this weather. His tan raincoat was wet and splotched and looked like the greasy wax paper they use for deli meat. He fished his Pall Malls out of his right pocket and set one on fire. He knew I didn't mind and it didn't matter anyway. Even when he wasn't smoking, he smelled like he was. His open mouth was like an idling car. Why are you in a bad way, Lou? What's going on? I pushed my ashtray, littered with the ends of joints, closer to his side of the desk. You know I lost a kidney, right? He said. Yeah, of course, I said. I visited you, remember? I took a joint out of my desk drawer, struck a match, and lit up. But I knew I wouldn't get high. I've smoked too much over the years, and I'm saturated with THC. So at this point, it's just a placebo that takes the edge off, makes the nightmare something you don't have to wake up from. You know it's all a dream, even if it's a bad dream. I know, Lou said. I'm just saying, you know I lost one, and now, well, the good kidney, which wasn't that good, is going. And I'm looking at dialysis. And dialysis is a living death. He sucked on his cigarette. Lou Shelton had been smoking 2 packs a day since he was 15. He'd had open heart surgery 3 times and had more stents than fingers. He'd survived mouth cancer and throat cancer and tongue cancer, and his voice was a toss-up between a rasp, a wheeze, and a death rattle. I'd seen him once with his shirt off, and he had a fat scar like an ugly red snake down the middle of his chest. It was a zipper that kept getting opened, and from being in hospital so much, he had a more or less permanent case of MRSA, which made him prone to boils on his ass that had to be lanced. And he sucked on the Pall Mall. Like I said, he was a hard man to kill. Well, that's all I'll read. Thank you for listening out there.
Thank you for reading. That was a great read, Jonathan. It's such a great opening, and you really capture the hard-boiled nature of previous noir fiction, and so many great sentences. I think my favorite in that passage you just read was, his open mouth was like an idling car. I love that. So another thing besides the things you mentioned that makes Happy different is that he sees a Freudian analyst, I think it is 4 times a week.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Can you tell us why he sees an analyst, or would that be a spoiler?
I don't think it's a spoiler. He was in a real bad way. He had a lot of trauma in his life. His mother died in childbirth, which kind of broke his father. His father was a hard drinking Navy man. So he was raised by a very tough dad who was broken by the death of his wife and maybe resented his son for that. Then other strange things happened in his childhood. Then he joined the Navy. After the Navy, he was in the cops, in the LAPD, working in the juvenile division, saw terrible things happening to children. So he had collected a lot of emotional scar tissue. And then in his mid-40s, he got his heart broken, started having a lot of suicidal ideation, and called, the policemen's union, even though he had been out of the police for 10 years working as a private detective. And there was an analytic institute that would see ex-cops and ex-military pro bono, because otherwise he couldn't afford analysis 4 times a week. And so he starts going to analysis, lying on the couch, not old-fashioned Freudian analysis. And slowly he's begun to involve himself in what Freud called the talking cure. By simply talking, by being witnessed by another human being day after day, he came to know himself, reveal himself to himself, and get in touch with hopefully his own innate wisdom and clarity. It's almost really, analysis in some ways is just an ancient thing. It's sort of speaking to an elder, to a wise person, and overcoming self-deception just through this daily thing of talking and all the stories you tell yourself, and maybe they begin to get revealed. So yeah, so he's on the couch 4 days a week, and you know, he's certainly not cured. He's a little too dependent on marijuana, and he's, you know, been celibate for years and when it comes to women, he's sort of taking almost a doctor's vow, do no harm, you know, because he's been so troubled. But he's hopeful that he might become more at peace with himself. But then the events of the novel occur and really throw a wrench in things. If you notice, I just jumped here a moment, that alligator shifted and fell, and I was like, whoa, is there an animal here? And anyway.
Yeah, the editorial director of your publisher has described Happy Doll as a neurotic Jack Reacher. Jack Reacher, of course, is the famous Lee Child character. And he says, the editorial director also says that he's a neurotic Jack Reacher with the soul of a poet. What do you think of that description?
Well, I like it. I'm a Lee Child fan. Lee Child, who, you know, I met, we gave a reading together, luckily for me, at the 92nd Street Y, and the Jack Reacher books really inspired me to try to produce a book a year and to create a hero. And actually it was the Reacher books and several other pulp writers like David Goodis, Donald Westlake, which kind of very much inspired me to write my first big foray into page turners, which was You Were Never Really Here. And an interesting thing about Lee Child is this book came out of an assignment, in a sense, from Lee Child. Akashic Books, which does all these things like Milwaukee Noir, Chicago Noir, LA Noir. So they were doing a noir book about cigarettes, you know, assembled by Lee Child. Lee Child loves to smoke. He's a big smoker. And so he wanted to do a book of noir with cigarettes as the theme. So they contacted me, could you write a short story for $250, you know, maybe 10 pages, a little noir story about cigarettes, where somehow cigarettes factor into it importantly. So I began writing A Man Named Doll. But I got more than 10 pages into it. I thought, you know what? This is not a $250 short story. I think this is going to be a novel. I better put this to the side. And I wrote another story for them called Deathbed Vigil, where cigarettes factor in. So it's just interesting that, you know, Jack Reacher, Lee Child comes up because it was because of Lee Child, in the sense that I wrote this book. And even though the book didn't end up in that anthology, which was called The Nicotine Chronicles, if people wanted to find it. Yeah, and Happy definitely has some neuroses. And he might have the soul of a poet, perhaps, because he does notice the beauty of things. He tries to be mindful. He tries to slow down. There's that wonderful passage in Our Town when Emily comes back from the grave, and it's a wonderful play. I'm sure most people out there and their computers are familiar with Thornton Wilder and Our Town. But this young woman dies in childbirth, not unlike in my novel, gets to come back for one day, like when she's in high school, and her family's getting ready in the morning, and they're rushing about breakfast. There's her young brother, her mother, her father, and she's getting to be herself again at age 17. And then she turns to the narrator. There's a wonderful stage manager of the play, almost, you know, breaking the third wall. And she goes, oh my God, do we ever stop and look at each other? Do we ever take a moment to appreciate each other? I'm not giving the line as beautiful as it is.
You're doing well, though.
All right, thank you. And I'm sorry for the long-winded answer. And so then the stage manager says, you know, in answer, do people ever stop? Do they ever notice? Like, you have beautiful flowers behind you. And he goes, well, a few people do. Some saints, maybe, some poets. Anyway, so Happy does try to stop and notice the beauty of the world.
And that especially one of the ways that Happy notices the beauty of the world is his relationship with his dog, George. It's such a beautiful relationship. Can you talk a bit about their relationship?
Yeah, I felt bad when Chris was speaking. I thought, you know, since I'm not home, I've done 2 other virtual things. I try to get my dog to hop in my lap. So I was looking at my phone. I'm like, oh, I've got to come up with a picture of George, or the role model for George, which is my dog. And so if people could see him there, his name is Fezzik. You know,
Oh, yeah.
they get a sense of him. I mean, he's got beautiful eyes.
Oh, yeah. He's a cutie.
Yeah. So anyway, yeah, Happy, who, like I said, is celibate, but he loves his dog, George, who is a rescue. And George comes with him on the case. And yeah, he and George is kind of like his guardian angel in a way. And the 2 of them really communicate. And so I think, you know, it's through George that Happy's heart maybe begins to heal.
Yeah.
H-E-A-L, not H-E-E-L.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you for pointing that out, Jonathan. I wouldn't have got that. That's very good. Yeah. Your fellow crime fiction writers, Megan Abbott and Adam Sternberg, have both compared Happy, or Hank, as he prefers to be called. They both compared him to Elliot Gould's portrayal of Philip Marlowe in Robert Altman's The Long Goodbye, which makes me wonder, was Gould Marlowe an influence when you were developing the character of Hank Dahl?
He wasn't, but it was interesting as I began to think about the book as a film. I watched or rewatched that movie, and yeah, Elliot Gould is great in the role, and he has a cat, which is, you know, he doesn't have a dog, and the film begins in this great way of him feeding the cat and muttering to himself, and yeah, he's. I think I could see where they drew a comparison. I didn't have him in mind myself. And in Robert Altman's The Long Goodbye, Gould lives in this amazing apartment, which isn't too far from where I live in LA, which you have to, like, you park down on a street and then you go up in this tower in an elevator, maybe 3 stories. And on the side of a hill are a few little apartments tucked away. And when I first moved to LA in 2014, I had a friend of mine, a guy I was going to be working with. I doubt he's watching, but I'll give him a shout out in case he's here. Unlikely. Duncan Birmingham, sweet fellow. He took me around LA, and I wanted to see the Elliot Gould, Philip Marlowe apartment. And luckily, right when we pulled up to this cul-de-sac in the Hollywood Hills, someone was going into that elevator, and we said, could we join you? And you know, the guy said yes. It's a crazy place to live. You'd have to take an elevator down for your garbage, and then there's a walkway above. It's a really romantic, odd spot. And so I actually got to go up there where Robert Altman filmed. And it was amazing to think about them getting all this film equipment up there and doing all sorts of stuff like that.
Oh, cool. That's very cool. You did a great job of world building in this novel. If I'm not mistaken, the novel is set in the present day, right?
Yes, I made specifically to set it after the fact in 2019, since our world has changed so much. But yes, right. It's very close to present.
Yeah. So you've got it set in contemporary times, but at the same time, you're also paying tribute to the past of Los Angeles. You've created what I would call this kind of retro contemporary vibe. How did you find the right balance to pull this off? Because I'm thinking this is something you must have been conscious of when you were writing the book.
Well, you know, I'm not sure that I was necessarily. I mean, I used to teach a lot of writing for about 12, 13 years was the main way I supported myself, was teaching writing. And my main advice, or one of my big points of advice for students, was write the kind of books you love to read, because that's sort of what you've been studying. That's what you've been absorbing, almost like musicians making the music that they love to listen to or are influenced by. Artists are always responding to other artists. And so I think the music of noir fiction, or the music of Chandler was just in my head. And then as I used to tell my students, you know, you're not copying or mimicking necessarily, you're taking in this thing, and then it's coming back out through the shape of your spirit, the shape of your soul. And I used to say the embouchure of their soul, or their spirit, or their psyche, because I often mention this, but years ago I saw that Ken Burns documentary on jazz, and every musician that you would see a talking head clip, even if it was from the past, Charlie Parker would say that he was, influenced or responding to Dizzy Gillespie, or Miles Davis would say that he was responding to Charlie Parker. And so even if, let's say, they both played the trumpet, their mouth was different, their embouchure, so their sound would come out different. So I tell my students, let's say you love Stephen King, write a book, the kind of book Stephen King writes, but it's going to come through your spirit, the shape of your mouth, as it were, your metaphorical mouth, and it'll be unique unto you. So I'm just saying, I absorbed so much of these page turners that I put it out through my spirit. So maybe that's why it has that old-fashioned feeling.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a beautiful, very poetic phrase, the embouchure of their soul, of your soul kind of thing. That's a beautiful way of putting it. It takes me back to when I took trumpet lessons when I was a teenager, and then we were always talking about trumpet lesson. The teacher was always talking about the embouchure and everything. So thank you for that. That was beautiful. It's often said that, oh no, sorry, I wanted to ask you this first. How would you describe the Jonathan Ames version of noir? How do you see noir?
Yeah, well, I was sort of thinking about it today. One thing, I was just like, oh, everyone's calling me a crime novelist now. And my little fantasy for me is more like to be a pulp writer. But pulp meaning that I write a book a year. But the pulp writers actually wrote 2 or 3 books. I mean, Jim Thompson, Donald Westlake, they would, that's how they supported themselves. They wrote a lot of books. And yet there was style to them. So I still want to write, I guess, literature where the sentence is pleasing. But I guess my version of noir, and I said this, is there's also light. It's not, I want my character to be a hero. I want him to be on the side of good. And I want him, as I mentioned, to see the beauty in life. But, he's battling his demons and confused people who are acting out in the world, who are misguided. And so I guess my version of noir does, and I said this is like, it's like a window with, well, actually it's sort of perfect for like a noir film. They always have blinds and some light comes through. So that's my version of noir. There is light coming through those blinds, or if it's later noir, there's neon throbbing through those blinds. It's not totally dark. My own worldview is not dark. My own worldview is ultimately optimistic.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's often said that when writing a mystery, the writer has to come up with the ending first. Is that what you did when you were working on A Man Named Doll?
Yeah, I think that's true. I hadn't heard that, but with Doll, and usually with the things I write, whether it be an essay, a TV script, or a novel, now I don't know if I knew where I wanted the extra man to go. Maybe I did, this novel I wrote a long time ago, but you often know the climax, and you have to get there. That's like the mountain you have to get to, and maybe the beginning, and then the middle is like, how do you get there? And that's the discovery. And so the climax, and then what follows the climax you don't know. That comes from the gods, which is kind of like, oh, the last musical note. You don't know that last sentence, but you need to know your climax, so you know where you're headed towards, and it's this thing you want to get to. And I was thinking with the next Doll book, which is called The Wheel of Doll, I realized, and I'm saying this out loud, I don't have clarity on that. And I was thinking, while I'm here in Florida, I need to get clarity on my goal line, because I did know where I wanted Doll to go pretty early in the process. You don't know necessarily at first. Maybe at first I just sort of began with the character, and the dilemma. And then I knew like, oh, I know what I want to have happen to him, which I won't reveal, you know, but,
Yes.
And so anyway, but that is true. You need to know where you're going, because otherwise you're going to meander perhaps nuttily and it won't add up.
Yeah. So it's kind of a tricky thing to pull off though, because yeah, you need to know where you're going, but at the same time, the more you write and inhabit the characters, the more you write of them, the more real they become, I would think. And so, you know, you could make a case that you could argue, you could say, well, I'm just still getting to know my characters. They'll tell me how it should end, but that's probably not the case. I guess it maybe is for some writers.
Yeah, well, I mean, maybe, yeah, it could be they're just want to be with the character. They have a little bit of a problem. I do think, I could be wrong, every writer is different, but I think what you said initially, whether mystery writer or not, that you need this place you want to get to. Like I said, when I used to teach writing, there was a really good quote from E.M. Foster, and in which he sort of said that like when he wrote his book, A Passage to India, he knew that something happened in the Malabar caves. So he had to get these people to the Malabar caves. And so I think you do need a goal line of some sort, this climax. Now, of course, it could change along the way. Maybe a new vision comes to you, but maybe not. Like I said, the mystery, not the mystery, but the unknown is the denouement, which is your last bit of poetry, the end of the song, you know, the setting of the sun.
Yeah, I want to run a Raymond Chandler quote by you. Chances are it's a quote you're familiar with. Quote, "The perfect detective story cannot be written. The type of mind which can evolve the perfect problem is not the type of mind that can produce the artistic job of writing," unquote. What do you think of that quote?
Could you say it again? I saw that something popped up, a note here, and I don't have ADD, but I saw a note from Chris to people, and suddenly I got confused. Could you say that again?
Sure.
I want to
Okay, so here's the quote again. "The perfect detective story cannot be written. The type of mind which can evolve the perfect problem is not the type of mind that can produce the artistic job of writing."
Well, you know, I guess the main thing I key on to that quote, and I love Chandler. I mean, Raymond Chandler, I'm rereading him again for the umpteenth time. He just, I mean, the Marlowe voice is so funny and articulate, and the prose is so beautiful, and Chandler's thoughts about detective stories. But I think the main thing, the word I'm keying on here, I'm not sure if I can parse out what he's saying but is the word perfect. There's nothing perfect in the world. You know, the perfect story, the perfect novel, there is no such thing as perfection per se, I guess. I don't know, at least nothing we make. And so, but maybe he's saying like the very neat and tidy Sherlock Holmes, like Chandler hated those kind of stuffy drawing room mysteries where the candle was found that clobbered the person over the head. And so he thought that was just so dull and boring. And I guess maybe the equivalent of like, you know, a crossword puzzle or something in terms of writing, or, you know, not even at the height of a crossword puzzle, more like one of those, the kind of puzzle where the little pieces you put together. Oh, the jigsaw puzzle.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think he was really against the neat and tidy mystery. I think, and I was reading this introduction to a collection of his short stories just the other night, this wonderful collection of his, and I think I hadn't read it for a while, but the title is Trouble Is My Business. And there are 4 wonderful Chandler stories. And in some ways, maybe even better than the novels, because most of his novels, which are great, came from short stories that he, you know, stole from, that he had written in the 30s. And then he would take an opening from one short story, a middle from another one, and he would cobble together these Frankensteins. and because he knew that these pulp stories would be out of print. But there's 4 stories in Trouble Is My Business, and I think one other collection that he didn't cannibalize. And they're kind of perfect little gems. And in his introduction, what he is into is more, he said, a mystery that gives you many good scenes. Like he's happy to have the mystery and solve things, but what he was into was creating good scenes and moments. And so I think this might reflect a bit of his ethos, that the story served the scenes, almost like a meal would be its many courses. You have your opening, let's say you have a 5-course meal. He was into each course, and if it added up to a great meal, wonderful, but he was really into each course being fantastic. Anyway, I'm rambling, but it's an interesting quote, and he had a great mind. And one thing I always like to point out to people is that Raymond Chandler and P.G. Wodehouse went to the same public school in England. And
Wow.
P.G. Wodehouse is one of my other great heroes. And my novel, Wake Up, Sir, was an entire homage to P.G. Wodehouse. So, and I think they were there around the same time. I wish, I'd like to do research. Did Raymond Chandler and P.G. Wodehouse cross paths? Somebody should make a movie of that. Like, the greatest comedic writer of the 20th century and perhaps the greatest detective novel writer of the 20th century. And the two of them could go on a caper. And of course, there could be hijinks, you know?
Yeah. Or you could write it. I could see you write it.
You're right.
Yeah, you can write it. I don't know when you're going to have a chance to with this doll series, but who knows? But as you said, I agree with you. There's no such thing as perfection. But what book, can you point to a novel that you think comes closest to being the perfect detective story?
Yes. I think it could be, well, first of all, Richard Stark, pseudonym for Donald Westlake, all his Parker books are really great. And some of them are perhaps greater than others. For me, it's all one big continuum. So the 24 Parker novels are almost, to me, a source of perfection. But Dashiell Hammett's Red Harvest is a brilliant private detective novel. And Dashiell Hammett, you know, Chandler, when I talk about writers or artists responding to other writers, Chandler was very influenced, and I think very much in responding to Dashiell Hammett, and admired him tremendously. And so, you know, came up with his own music. But if you read Chandler closely, you see all sorts of, I feel like, allusions to Dashiell Hammett scenes, moments, and, you know, the Sam Spade character. But Hammett's main detective was known as the Continental Op. And Red Harvest is, you know, the Continental Op's biggest novel. And it's a brilliant piece of writing. And I think it could be perfect, or close to perfect, even though we just said there is no such thing as perfect.
Yes, exactly. Yes.
And
so I want to follow up on this Richard Stark pseudonym of Donald Westlake. But before I do that, I want to ask you, we got a question from Daniel Laroche. I hope I'm pronouncing your name right, Daniel. Forgive me if I'm not. And here's what he says. Hello, Mr. Ames. Is it sacrilegious to ask to have a character named Daniel Laroche in one of your future books? Even if it's just for one page, it would be so awesome. It would make my day, my year, my life. Haha. Return for your grand generosity. I could make a donation to the organization of your choice.
Oh, you know, that's interesting. Like, doesn't that kind of thing happen? Like, okay, you get your name, or you do a cameo, and you contribute to a charity or something like that. The name Daniel Laroche, and I've encountered Daniel in a very nice way on social media. Hello, Daniel. Is a great name for something noir, you know. Daniel Laroche. I mean, he does sound like perhaps. You know, I'm not saying you, Daniel, but you could be a bad guy, or, you know, an antique dealer who's selling cocaine on the side in a shady way, and in a, you know, in a Chandler world. But what's interesting about that, in 1987, I met this character, this guy, and he begged me to put his name in my novel. Like, and I was working on my first novel, I Passed Like Night, which came out in 1989, 32 years ago. And this guy begged me to put his name in my novel, and I said yes for some reason, you know, and I was like, okay, I'll do it. Like, it was so important to him. Well, I never saw him again, but I put his name in my novel. Well, 30 years later, a dear friend of mine is in therapy in New York City. I won't give anything away. He wouldn't mind. A comedian named Murray Hill. People should look him up. And Murray was talking about me because we were trying to do some TV work together. He's talking to his therapist about Jonathan Ames and his friend Jonathan Ames. The guy goes, Jonathan Ames, and the man takes my first book off his shelf and he goes, my name is in his book. I asked him to put my name in his book. So there was a brief character of a policeman. I forget the guy's name. I'm sorry. Not that he would be listening. And so can you believe it? 30 years later, a friend of mine is seeing a therapist, and the therapist is this guy who in the late 80s had asked me to put his name in my novel, and he had kept my book proudly on his shelf in his therapy office for years. I mean, I haven't fully explored the hugeness of that bizarre coincidence. In fact, next time I get to New York, I need to go with Murray and see his therapist. In my TV show, we once had something called friendship counseling. I came up with it myself. And, you know, Murray and I could go for friendship counseling, or we should surprise his therapist and I should show up and be like, hey, you know, here I am.
Yeah, you've got to follow up on that when you get a chance. Yeah, that's an incredible coincidence. And the fact that his name is Murray Hill makes me think that's another good Noir name, because in the sense it appears in Story Wrong Number. Barbara Stanwyck, Murray Hill, you know, she's trying to get a hold of the operator. Murray Hill 5000 or whatever it is.
Right.
That's a Noir name, just like Daniel's name is. Yeah, I wanted to get back to Richard Stark, which is one of the pseudonyms for the great mystery novelist Donald Westlake. You have said that you want to be like Richard Stark, and that's sort of what's prompting this kind of reinvention of your career as a noir novelist, right?
Yes.
Yeah. So what is it about Westlake's work under the name of Richard Stark that you want to emulate?
You know, well, first of all, I love to hit a writer that has a vein of books where, you know, it's just not 2 or 3, but where you can just read them, you know, for months because they have so many. And so Richard Stark, pseudonym for Donald Westlake. And one of the things I love about Dashiell Hammett was that you felt like his prose had been written by a rivet gun, and what I call, you know, tough poetry, or the poetry of noir. And so Stark was so much like Hammett, but there were 24 books. I mean, Dashiell Hammett wrote a fair amount, but then at a certain point, Dashiell Hammett just started writing, somewhat tragically and sadly, you know, didn't produce any. He was once the #1 novelist in America in the 30s, and then he stopped writing basically from like 1937 until his death in 1961, and something like that. But Stark wrote these 24 books under that pseudonym, and actually 28, you know, there are 4 ancillary novels to the Parker books. And I think it was masterful storytelling. The plots, you just turn the pages. You just can't stop. And then also the prose was fantastic. And the character of Parker is a sociopath, but he's got a sort of moral code. So you do root for him, even though it's always about heists. But it's more about problem solving. And so what made me want to be like Richard Stark was that he compelled me to turn the pages. I had to keep reading. And, you know, okay, I would go to bed at night, but I didn't want to turn off the light. And so I really wanted to create that feeling for the reader, you know. And so I read Stark over and over. I read those 24 books. I've probably read them 4 or 5 times. And I often say I'm like, a bizarre eccentric who'll only eat, star-kissed tuna or something like that. And, just I eat one, food. And for a while, off and on for years, all I'll read is Stark. But now I know them so well, it's almost like, a groove in a pinball machine. But the same thing had happened with me in Woodhouse. I kept rereading the Woodhouse books until I was desperate to write my own version of a Woodhouse book. So it's just the magic of Stark that he just made you just so compulsively turn the page. I wanted to learn how to do that.
How did you discover Richard Stark's novels?
In a very fun, interesting way. I had met the comedian Jeff Garlin. I've told this story a couple of times, and we had performed together. I actually ran into him at Skylight Books in Los Angeles. He bought a copy of my novel, Wake Up, Sir. We had done it, I often in the past would perform somewhat as a comedian, but more as a monologuist. So we kept crossing paths. We got a little bit friendly. And then at a certain point, he was writing a book and he needed help writing the book. He'd never written a book before, but he had a book contract. And it was, I think, very much about his environmentalism and things like that. And he needed basic advice. Like, he was told, I think he had to produce 50,000 words. He had no idea how many pages is that. So I was at the time working on my TV show, bored to death. And I was keeping very long hours, but at night I'd go to the Russian bathhouse in New York. And I said, meet me at the baths and I'll try to help you, whatever questions you have. So we met at the baths. We talked for an hour. I gave him a set of instructions. You're going to need to dictate this 10 pages a day to meet your deadline, 12-point font, 300 words a page, revise for maybe the first half hour every day, what you did the day before, but then move on. You got to do another 10 pages. Gave him like these marching orders. And the guy's a brilliant artist and comedian, and he did it. And he was so grateful to me. He mentioned me in his introduction. And so he gave a reading at Skylight Books of this book, which I read a while ago now. I'm blanking on the title. I apologize. I'm sure he's not in the audience. Anyway, as we were leaving Skylight Books, I think not Skylight, Book Court in Brooklyn. As we were leaving, we passed the mystery section. He stopped. He was looking. I said, have you ever read Richard Stark? I'm like, no. I said, no. He goes, oh. And he pulled the first one in the series off the shelf. He goes, I'm getting this for you. He's going to change your life. And he got me the first Stark novel, The Hunter. And sure enough, it changed my life. So that's how I got into Stark. And then as another favor for me helping him with the book, he cast me in Curb Your Enthusiasm. And I played Larry David's accountant in an episode, I think in season 7 or season 8. It was like the Periscope episode, which was a lot of fun. So I got a lot came out of this one skull session with Jeff Garlin.
Yeah. Yeah, that's great. That's wonderful that that happened. Because it changed your life and changed our lives because we get to read, the Doll series of books. So that's wonderful. Chris popped up a message and said that it was the name of the book by Jeff Garlin was Curbing It. Does that sound right?
I think there was another one.
Yeah. Okay. Anyway, we're almost out of time, Jonathan, but I want to ask you another question we got from an audience member, Jonathan Blostein or Blostein. I apologize, Jonathan. Hopefully one of the two pronunciations is right. He asks, how close to your imaginary vision of the Jonathan Ames character did Jason Schwartzman get in the HBO Bored to Death TV show? And he also wants to know, is it hard to translate your written persona onto screen like that?
I think Jason captured he wasn't really me, that character, even though he had my name, but Jason became whoever that Jonathan Ames was. Again, we're using the word perfect. He was a perfect incarnation. I had tried playing myself in a first foray into television and sort of failed miserably. My joke at the time was, I didn't prepare enough for the role or something like that, or, I couldn't inhabit the character. And I was playing a version of myself. And I had pitched that TV show as a poor man's Curb Your Enthusiasm. And it was called What's Not to Love. based on my first essay collection. And I pitched it saying it's a poor man's Curb Your Enthusiasm, but literally I'm poor, because at the time I was a poor writer and Larry David was wealthy. This was back in 2003. And anyway, so when I got a second shot at TV several years later, I knew not to make the same casting mistake again, i.e. put myself in the role. I met Jason, and he was just the perfect embodiment of this nutty dreamer in Bored to Death, who related to our theme as someone who's read so many private detective novels that he thinks he could be a private detective, in very much the same way that Don Quixote read so many books of chivalry that he thought he could be a knight, or thought he was a knight. So Jason was perfect. And if anything, the character who, in some ways, who I spoke most directly through on that show was the Ted Danson character, because I was a little bit older than the Jonathan Ames version in that show. I mean, these are odd things to say, the Jonathan Ames version. There was an odd time when that show was out, because I would see articles saying, the real Jonathan Ames, you know, it's like, oh, that, because we all have our own confused sense of self. And I don't know if I have ever felt real. But anyway, but it was, the George Christopher was a little bit more my mouthpiece, my direct mouthpiece. So yeah. The Jason character also, Jonathan character, and on set everyone called me Jason, called him Jonathan. It was all confused in a wonderful way. We were like a happy family. It was like that Tolstoy line, all happy families, or all whatever.
Mm-hmm. Was it a difficult transition for you to go from writing about characters named Jonathan Ames to characters that were not named Jonathan Ames?
No, I dropped writing about myself a long time ago now, happily so, or happily doll so.
Very good.
I exhausted that in the early part of the century. I had a column for a throwaway newspaper in New York from 1997 to 2000, in which it was a nonfiction column, though I very much exaggerated things or made myself a character, kind of like Bukowski did when he had a column in a throwaway paper. And I don't do that kind of writing anymore. You know, after a while, it sort of became shtick. And a lot of the things I wrote back then, I sort of regret, like, because, you know, anyway, I was young and didn't know much better. But yeah, so I'm happy to not, I'm happy doll to not write about me anymore or directly.
Yeah, very well said. Jonathan Ames, thank you very much. It was such a pleasure to talk to you, and congratulations again on A Man Named Doll. What a great book. I look forward to reading The Wheel of Doll and rereading A Man Named Doll. And thanks to Daniel Golden, Chris Lee, and everyone else at Boswell Book Company for making this happen. And it was an honor to be part of this virtual Boswell Thrill Walkie event. And thanks to Wisconsin Public Radio for their support. And thanks to you out there, everyone, for joining us. Take care.
And thank you, Doug. Before they shut us off, have you shut us off yet?
I don't think so.
Oh, okay. Well, I want to thank you, Doug. Thank everyone for coming. Boswell Books, which used to be called at one time Schwartz Books, and I was a side of my family is Schwartz, but I always like to end my events with this nutty sound. It was a sound my friends and I would make on the playground when being attacked by more normal children, and it's known as the Harry call. And I sort of have to do it every time in the OCD way. So I'll do a Harry call and then turn it back over to Chris. And thank you, Doug. It was really nice talking to you and meeting you.
Oh, thank you. The pleasure's all on this side of the Zoom meeting. Trust me.
Well, on this side too. All right, so here's a Harry call. Again, the sound my friends and I would make on the playground when being attacked by more normal children. Thank you.
Thank you, Jonathan Ames. That was great. Wonderful.
I can't think of a better way to end an event than that, and I don't know how I should follow that. Other than to say, yeah, I don't think I can. I want to thank you all for being here tonight. What a great chat. Doug, Jonathan, thank you both so much for joining me this evening. This has been fantastic. Thanks again to WPR for their co-sponsorship of this event and the sport. And thanks to all of you who joined us this evening. We would not have a bookstore without you. Snag your copy of A Man Named Doll. We'd love it if you get it from us. I understand some of you may be zooming in from other locations. Whatever your favorite independent bookstore, independent bookseller happens to be near you. Have a wonderful night, everyone. Goodbye.
All right. Thank you.
Thanks, Chris. Thanks, Jonathan.
Thank you.